August 9, 1965. A press conference in Singapore. Kuan, the prime minister of a country that had existed for 2 years, stops mid-sentence, takes off his glasses, and asks the cameras to stop rolling. They don't. He's crying on live television, announcing that Singapore has just been forced out of the Federation of Malaysia. Behind that broadcast was a city of 1.88 million people with no army, no natural resources, and no fresh water of its own. Unemployment sat above 10%. More than 7 in 10 people were living in slums. 60 years later, the average person in that same city out-earns the average American, measured by what their money actually buys where they live. This is the story of how that happened and what it cost to make it happen. In 1965, Singapore had almost nothing going for it on paper. No oil, no minerals, no timber. It imported its own drinking water and even the sand it needed for construction, under agreements with Malaysia, the same country that had just voted it out. Infant mortality sat around 26 per 1,000 births. Literacy was near 57%. The Singapore River was, by most accounts, an open sewer running through the middle of the city. There was a second blow coming. In 1968, Britain announced it would pull its military bases out of Singapore entirely within 3 years. Those bases weren't a minor line item. They accounted for roughly 20% of the country's direct GDP, according to World Bank figures, and employed more than 40,000 people. 2 economic pillars, both gone inside 3 years. Kuan didn't build the recovery alone. Dr. Keng Swee, his finance and defense minister, was the technical architect, the man who built the Economic Development Board and designed the industrial strategy from the ground up. Rajaratnam, the foreign minister, built the diplomatic cover story, a small, non-aligned, multiracial nation that posed no threat to anyone and could be trusted by the Western corporation Singapore was about to court aggressively. Here's the part almost nobody tells you. The plan that saved Singapore had almost nothing to do with free market orthodoxy. It involved the government taking direct ownership of land, labor, and capital on a scale of state control over an economy that no G7 nation currently practices. We're going to walk through exactly how that worked and why it produced a level of wealth that neither pure socialism nor pure free market capitalism had managed to produce on its own. By the late 1960s, Keng Swee's Economic Development Board was doing something almost no other newly independent nation was doing. While countries across Asia and Africa were nationalizing industries and turning inward, Singapore went straight to the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies. The pitch: 0 corporate tax for up to 10 years, strike-free labor guaranteed through a state-aligned union, fully built industrial parks ready to move into, and English as the default working language. Texas Instruments, National Semiconductor, Hewlett-Packard, Shell, and Mobil all built major operations in Singapore within a few years of hearing that pitch. That solved the jobs problem. It didn't solve the capital problem. A country this small couldn't rely on foreign investment alone to fund its own infrastructure, and it had no oil revenue and no deep domestic bond market to lean on. So the government reached directly into people's paychecks. The Central Provident Fund, first set up under British rule in 1955, became the engine of the entire model. At its historical peak in the 1980s, half of every worker's gross salary was withheld. 25% from the worker, 25% matched by the employer. Today, that figure sits closer to 37% combined for workers 55 and under. This wasn't a retirement account in the way Americans think of one. It was forced national savings on a scale that produced one of the highest domestic savings rates ever recorded, north of 40% of GDP, which meant Singapore never had to depend on volatile foreign debt markets to build itself. Here's the systemic piece most explainer videos skip entirely. None of this works without the second lever, land. In 1966, the government passed the Land Acquisition Act, allowing it to buy private land at below market rates for public development. State-owned land went from around 44% in 1960 to more than 80% today. That land became the foundation for the Housing and Development Board, which used citizens' own locked-up CPF savings to sell them 99-year leasehold flats. Public housing homeownership went from a slum statistic to somewhere around 88 to 89%, depending which year's figures you're looking at. Sit with what actually happened there for a second. The same government that took a chunk of every paycheck also became the landlord, the developer, and the mortgage lender, and then sold citizens equity in the very system that had taken their money in the first place. It's a closed loop. And it worked partly because of a fourth piece nobody in the West replicates easily. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau had authority to investigate anyone at any rank, and ministerial salaries were pegged to top private sector pay. A Singapore cabinet minister today earns somewhere between $800,000 and $1, $2 million USD a year, more than double a US president's salary. That wasn't generosity. It was a calculated bet that paying officials like bankers would remove the incentive to act like ones on the take. While Keng Swee was negotiating with American semiconductor executives in air-conditioned offices, most of the country was still living in wooden squatter housing with no plumbing, waiting for a government-built flat that wouldn't exist for years. They had no way of knowing that the money being withheld from their own wages was the exact capital eventually used to house them. This same structure, forced savings, state land ownership, a state investment arm to grow it all, shows up again decades later at a much bigger scale as GIC and Temasek Holdings, Singapore's sovereign wealth funds. That's the piece that turns a well-run city into a wealth superpower. And it's where the real gap between Singapore and the US opens up. By the 1990s, the machine Keng Swee designed had matured into a sovereign investment engine. GC and Temasek didn't just hold the country's reserves. They actively ran major corporations and deployed capital globally, converting decades of forced savings into productive, compounding assets. The result, according to the most recent IMF and World Bank figures, Singapore's GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power now sits somewhere around $133,000 to $140,000. The United States sits around $80,000 to $85,000. Nominal figures are much closer, roughly $84,000 to $88,000 for Singapore against $80,000 to $85,000 for the US, but purchasing power is the number that actually tells you what life costs and buys. And on that measure, the city with zero natural resources has pulled ahead of the country that runs the global economy. Here's the irony that makes this story worth telling. Singapore's gross government debt sits around 160% of GDP, a number that would set off alarms in Washington. But Singapore has zero net debt. By law, it cannot borrow to fund its own operating budget. Every dollar of debt it issues exists to give the CPF and local markets a safe place to invest, and the proceeds get funneled straight into GIC. The country that looks the most indebted on paper is, in reality, a net creditor sitting on hundreds of billions in surplus reserves. What the world sees and what's actually happening are close to opposite here. This is the point where most videos about Singapore stop, impressed, a little envious, and done. But the systemic lesson underneath this story isn't really about Singapore. It's about what a country is willing to trade for compressed, forced capital formation. The same mechanism that turns Singapore into a creditor nation also produces some of the most expensive ordinary life on earth. Buying a basic mid-sized sedan means paying roughly $20,000 for the car itself, then bidding for a 10-year certificate of entitlement that can run $75,000 to $100,000 on top of registration fees and taxes that add another $30,000 to $50,000. The total on-the-road cost for an ordinary family car can exceed $150,000. That's not a luxury tax. That's the price of admission to a country that decided decades ago it would rather ration road space through cost than through congestion. The same government that built roughly 88% homeownership also runs the Internal Security Act, which allows detention without trial, and POFMA, which lets ministers order platforms to remove or correct content they deem false. Public protests require police permits. Even a single person standing alone with a sign can be shut down under the law. The wealth engine and the control apparatus were built by the same hands at the same time for the same reason. Lee Kuan Yew believed political stability was the precondition for everything else, and he wasn't interested in litigating that point through elections he might lose. Underneath the skyline, the machine runs on labor that never gets to share in the equity model built for citizens. Close to 1.8 million non-resident foreign workers, roughly 31% of the population, live in Singapore on temporary permits with no path to citizenship, many housed in purpose-built dormitories on the industrial edges of the island. The country's fertility rate has fallen below 0.97 children per woman, well under replacement level, which means this two-tier labor system isn't a side note anymore. It's a structural requirement for the model to keep running at all. That's the parallel worth sitting with. The U.S. debates immigration policy and infrastructure spending as separate political fights. Singapore never separated them. It built one machine that solved housing, savings, and labor supply together at the cost of civil liberties most Americans would not accept, and a demographic dependency it now cannot easily undo. Lee Kuan Yew remained prime minister until 1990 and continued shaping policy from senior cabinet positions for years after that, until his death in 2015. The island that couldn't feed or house itself now sits on sovereign reserves most G7 finance ministers would envy. What the full internal accounting of Temasek and GIC's holdings actually looks like has never been fully disclosed to the public. Under current law, it may never be. If you want to see what happens when a country makes the opposite bet, spending its way toward growth instead of forcing its way there, the Argentina default story follows a pattern you'll recognize immediately, just running in reverse. Singapore didn't get rich by being free. It got rich by deciding decades in advance exactly how much freedom it was willing to trade, and it never once asked its citizens to vote on the price.